Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the 111th session of LUMS Live. Today's speaker is Dr. Ghazal Asif Farooqi, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at LUMS. My name is Aman Jaffer. I am also an assistant professor at LUMS. I teach sociology there. Dr. Ghazal Asif, her research and teaching focus on post-colonial regimes of legality and governance, domesticity, kinship and gender, and everyday life, memory and identity in multi-religious and multi-ethnic societies. Doctoral dissertation, which she did at Johns Hopkins University, and it is titled Marvi's Sisters, Hindu Belonging and the Muslim State in Pakistan. This excellent dissertation has received an honorable mention for the 2021 SS Pirzada Dissertation Prize in Pakistan Studies. And her writing has been most recently been published in Political and Legal Anthropology and in South Asia. The title of her talk, which draws from her dissertation research, is The Net of Kinship, Mothers, Daughters, and the Webs of Caste in Pakistan. Before I turn it over to Ghazal, as you know, the format of the talk, today's talk is going to be that Dr. Ghazal Asif will speak for around 20 to 30 minutes. Then we will have a short discussion based on her presentation, and then the floor will be open for Q&A. But if you have a question, please feel free to post it on Facebook, and we will be taking questions as we go along as well. So thank you for joining us again, and over to Dr. Ghazal Asif.
Thank you, Aman. It's really a pleasure to participate in these events. So thank you for having me. This is. I wish we could do this in person, but I think this is one of the last few Zoom things as we're moving in beyond the pandemic session, hopefully. So it's nice as a hurrah. So as Aman said, thank you for that lovely introduction. Today, what I'm doing is I wanted to share some of the questions that I grapple with in my ongoing book project, which builds on my dissertation that's titled Marvi's Sisters, Hindu Belonging in the Muslim State in Pakistan. It's very much a work in progress. I'm pretty excited to share this ongoing project with all of you, and I'm anticipating the question and answers, the questions both from you, Aman, and from the audience, because as I develop the manuscript, I'm hoping this will be very helpful. So essentially, this project is based on an ethnography I did as part of my PhD fieldwork. It's an ethnography of women from the Hindu religious minority in mid-sized towns in lower or southeastern Sindh, which I collate into, for reasons of anonymity, I refer to it as a fictional place called Lar Town. In this fictional place called Lar Town, I explore how the structural conditions of being religious minorities in a modern Muslim polity like Pakistan shapes women's political aspirations, everyday lives, and intimate relations. And as obviously we all know far too well, in the year since 1947, the promise of extending citizenship to Pakistan's religious minorities has vacillated between discriminatory neglect, overt regulation, and to say nothing of episodes of outright and spectacular violence. Based on my research, the central argument of my thesis is that for my interlocutors, the anxieties and pitfalls about having been rendered strangers in such a place seep into the everyday, from neighborly or intimate relations through the constitution of domestic life to embodied histories and practices. And ethnographically, my research focuses on this kind of seepage. I argue that this leads to a burden of sustaining communal and intimate life, which falls primarily on the women. And essentially, the question that they have to grapple with is how do the vicissitudes of everyday life inform alternative forms of belonging and exclusion? So in thinking about this question, I expand on the politics of memory, how, thinking about the lingering aftermaths of displacement, rupture, creating kinship and community and the pitfalls associated with that, and how contemporary techniques of governance and citizenship in Pakistan interpolate these formations and how they work together to displace our conventional understandings of how identity formation works, as well as, in a very broad, big picture sense, the continuing hegemony of the modern nation state, even within the intimate lives of gender relations. So the ethnographic research, that as I said, that this is all based on, it's, as I said, it's a fictional place I call Lartown. It's based on fieldwork across the Mirpur Khas, Umarkot, Mithi, and Islamkot districts of southeastern Sindh, with occasional trips to Badin and Thatta. Physically, I was based in this region between 2016 to 2018 for about 14 months continuously, and then on and off, I've been visiting the site since about 2014. And this region has a Hindu population estimated between 20 to 50%. It varies by individual district. And historically, these districts have all been part of a trading route between the contemporary provinces of Sindh and the Indian states of Gujarat and Rajasthan. This area today is a mixture of urban and rural environments and concerns. And therefore, as a locus of research, it helped me draw in caste, religion, and gender to weave practices and everyday life into larger questions about state and society, as I described earlier. So one key concern which has emerged as I've been writing is about the kinds of intimate and kin relations that can be produced in a landscape that is so fraught for citizens from religious minorities. And that's what I wanted to focus on today very quickly. So, in different chapters of the dissertation, I describe how Sindhi Hindu women stitch together everyday life and ordinary sociality from very meager resources that are offered by their fraught environs. This kind of focus, as I said, it highlights not just embodied histories, but also the ways in which older forms of social relations can return or linger despite what I think about as a seeming blockage of social memory in relations between Hindus and Muslims and others in Sindh, to create landscapes of forgetting, which is a theme I develop in other chapters. The different chapters of the dissertation focus on historical debates in the book project. It focuses on historical debates in the National Assembly. It focuses on legal debates and legal archives. It focuses on politics, the national census, and then I think so that's the first half, and the second half, which is what this talk draws from, is about thinking about intimate relations, kinship, and the emotional labor that women perform within those broader framing questions. So here, what I wanted to do today for a little bit is briefly meditate on one single family that I got to know very well during my fieldwork, and think about their social aspirations and intimate desires, which were interpolated by the kinds of categories of recognition through which, as Pakistani Hindu citizens, are governed, and the kinds of pressures those categories come with. This particular family belonged to the Kohli caste, which is classified as a historically oppressed or Dalit group. And this particular family had been on a very slow but fairly steady, upwardly mobile trajectory for about the past 2 generations, through government jobs and a fairly relentless focus on education, and as well as working within the community to build their social status within the caste group. This required very delicate acts of balance and suspension that comprised intimate and family relations. And I want to think about, normally when we think about kinship, especially in the South Asian context, we think about the making of kinship and the breaking of it. But I want to think about the labor it takes to keep what one of my interlocutors referred to as keeping people joined together. Logon ko jode rakhna. And within this family, there was one particular mother and daughter pair whose tensions and intimacies as well as their very different aspirations and the resentments for themselves and for one another, illuminate what I think about as almost exhausted forms of relationality and belonging that Pakistani Hindus have to navigate. So this was a mother and daughter pair. I will refer to them as Sita and Kiran. Sita, the mother, and Kiran, the daughter, spent a lot of time while I knew them being very anxious about Kiran's future prospects. And there was one mode in which their relationship was often expressed in front of me as well, which was a very frequently hurled accusation that the other had no sense of the importance of maintaining or preserving social bonds and relations. This accusation did not just crop up frequently, but was always profoundly upsetting to the receiver. And it showed how much these social bonds mattered to both. And what I began thinking about through my ongoing relationship with this family and with Sita and Kiran was how the tensions and intimacies of a mother and daughter relationship, which is one of the most intimate relationships that two women can have, against the backdrop of very deep-set casteist and religious prejudices, indicate the practices and compromises through which women mediate the emotional labor of kinwork with broader social aspirations. So just to give you a very brief overview of what they fought about, Sita, the mother, had led a very hard life. She had been married off at the age of 16 into this family. She had been, as a daughter-in-law who was thought to have married up, she had been expected to help cement her father-in-law's status by taking care of this new home instead of, working all day in the fields, which her own natal family did. But salaries stagnated, her father-in-law's and her husband's throughout the 1990s. She completed her education, paying her own fees through odd jobs, which infuriated her in-laws, but which she said to me eventually paid off. And by the time we first met in 2015, she had recently begun a very respectable office job in an NGO after years of contracting work. And she was very clear in her own mind that she was a success story in a social world with very few. Meanwhile, having failed an admission test for medical school in Hyderabad, 17-year-old Kiran had announced that she was uninterested in pursuing the professional career her mother had mapped out for her. Her mother hoped that she would be a doctor. And she instead wanted to marry as soon as possible the fiancé to whom she had been engaged since the age of 14 by her grandfather, her dada. Although Sita had consented to this match at the time, she now became very visibly agitated whenever it was brought up, and she would rail against what she saw not only as Kiran's lack of personal ambition, but a deliberate betrayal by her daughter of the legacy that she had sought to create. In fact, she had gone to the extent of, at the time of the medical admission test, she had actually told the fiance's family that they would not have the dowry ready in time for the wedding for at least 3 years. And she didn't want to break off the wedding, but she hoped that her daughter would use what she called the mohlat of a few years to obtain something that no one could take away from her, i.e. an educational degree, which Kiran was completely uninterested in. So Sita saw Kiran as willfully choosing a circumscribed life that would have been Sita's own fate had she not fought so valiantly to make something of herself. And one of the ways she would express this to me, usually when Kiran was in the same room and could hear her, was to say, everything that I have right now, I fought for, and this stupid girl, she just wants to erase it. It makes no difference to her. And this was said to me, but actually for Kiran's benefit, right? So Kiran had older brothers. The brothers were doing fairly well, but that did not seem to be as important to Sita as what Kiran, the only daughter, was going to do and what her prospects were. And, because it was so clear to both of them that what Kiran did reflected on Sita's own life and her judgments. I think about this through, there's scholars have thought about mother-daughter relationships through this idea of, the fact that it's not just an intimate kinship relationship the way that many others are, but there's a certain kind of, it's a unique relationship that is kind of an extension of flesh. There's a continuity of flesh, to use Irigaray's term in this, that is not always easily understood in a male social order, but makes sense within kind of one way to think about it is within a world of women where mothers and daughters are kind of become maybe unwillingly mirrors of each other, right? And it was for this reason that what Kiran did mattered so much to Sita. So, so it's not, I mean, I don't, anthropologically, obviously, this is not about, agentive cells waiting to be realized, but I want to think about how entangled relations and domestic constraints and the workings of power structures on communities shape such a relationship. So, this relationship entangled multiple trajectories, which you can think about them as parts of aspiration that Kiran wanted a certain kind of life, Sita wanted a certain kind of life, but what I found very interesting was how deeply they felt their different paths were actually completely entangled, and the kinds of tensions that built up. And I do want to point out here that their entanglements were also of specific modality of their social reality as Dalit Hindu women in Pakistan, and in the context of the very painstaking upward social mobility that this particular family had been on for a few generations. Their dilemma emerged through these very diverging trajectories, ideas of what trajectory their family's collective aspiration should follow, and what commitments are entailed in orienting oneself or orienting one's family to the future. So Kiran would describe her disagreements with her mother as taking place because Sita did not know how to keep relationships joined while moving forward. Rishte jode rakhkar saath chalna nahi aata. Kiran's turn of phrase would suggest either the presence or the absence of a conscious ethical comportment to enmesh oneself in social relations as you move forward to the future, right? Kiran's descriptions of her dilemmas, not just in conversation with her mother. And so Sita used similar words and would often frequently talk about the language of sacrifice, thinking about the way she had sacrificed so much for her daughter. And this language of sacrifice suffused their arguments with one another. And what I realized was that sacrifice was a ritual act which enabled the continuing sustenance of relations, right? The repetition of this motive clarified Kiran's conviction that she needed to substitute herself for the emotional gap Sita had left for the family, while Sita was insistent that her sacrifice needed to be cemented by Kiran, reaching a certain, agreeing to a certain form of success. And this obligation of continuing flesh made them constantly determined that the other had to stand in for each other in this structure. And that is where their anger and dilemma with each other came from. So not to take up too much of your time, but I just want to go back to thinking about what I realized as I got to know this family was a constant pressure of keeping relations joined together through specific situations. While both mother and daughter took very seriously their task of mediating their relationships with one another, these minor clashes reveal some of the labor through which women actually constantly think through their own forms of aspiration and the way that gendered mediation occupies a certain kind of logic in thinking about women's lives. So Sita and Kiran's story, the importance of laboring to keep relations joined together, is not about broken kinship or creating kinship, but thinking about how you can falter in a very intimate context and draw on very exhausted reserves to sustain and maintain themselves. In a context where one is very barely joined to a national community, which seems to be on an entirely divergent path to this family, I want to think about what kind of labor is entailed in keeping other social relations joined, and what is the compulsion to even do so. And I don't want to suggest an analogous situation here, right, in which you can read the relationship of minorities to the state as a filial one and think about stepmotherly treatment and all that. But I want to think about the way that Sita and Kiran diverged in, diverged in their opinions of a future social world in which they could live meaningful lives as Pakistani Hindu Dalit women, offered me a way to think about, the kinds of liberal aspirations caught up in these conversations, the limited options they had available to them, and how these issues became apparent within their attempts to forge a relationship with one another, and through that to the wider world. So I want to I want to think about this, and I wanted to share these vignettes with you because this sort of informs the lens I take in my dissertation generally, where I think about these very large questions about the relationship of minorities to the Pakistani state, but I seek to do this through thinking about the way very intimate relations in the most, sort of micro levels are shaped and are fought over and are determined in this particular region of Sindh. I think that such relationships are rendered almost unsustainable by these pressures of inhabiting or transgressing the categories through which Pakistan makes available to Hindus in particular and members of religious minorities in general. So these are some of the questions that I'm hoping to continue to tease out as I write this project. So yeah, thanks for listening to that. And any comments would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much, Ghazal. The larger project of both theoretical as well as substantive in terms of your own ethnography of thinking about. One of the things that I constantly was told by my own dissertation supervisor was how to think of the macro structures of relationships, and how to think of those in terms of exactly the kinds of intimate micro scale socialities that you're sort of illuminating so beautifully. So I think that's really, in a way, one of the key paths that I think social science in Pakistan generally needs to invest in. And so thank you for showing us a certain way of doing that. I wanted to start with the question about sociality. You sort of use this sort of very nice visual metaphor of sociality as something that is stitched together. I just wanted to actually hear a little bit more about how you sort of understand sociality, both theoretically but also from your empirical work as a concept. How does that kind of how do you kind of make sense of it and use it?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. So to me, theory is something I don't know if I have theoretical ways to think about it, but to me, I draw on the way my interlocutors thought of sociality. And one of them actually expressed quite vividly to me, actually, this was a metaphor that often came up in my research, was thinking about it as a jal, which you can think of both as a net and as a web, right? So, but thinking about the idea of a jal actually became very central to the way I was thinking about as I was doing my research and as I was writing about the way these kinds of socialities, because or thinking about social life, because what that metaphor really brought home for me was this idea that one, individual ties can fray, but this is about something about individual connections that create a much larger whole. So to me, that was very informative. The other thing that I really appreciate about that metaphor is the idea that this is something that is consciously constructed and woven together, right? It's not something that you receive. It's not something that one happens to fall into or to, be given in a certain set of relations or whatever it is, but something that you have to work very hard at maintaining, at using, at creating constantly. So I found that metaphor helpful in thinking about, the mic, and it's also helpful to use that metaphor to then think about the micro macro levels, as you pointed out. So that would be one way I could offer of thinking about sociality.
Sort of continuing on that point, when I was sort of hearing you describe the relations between Sita and Kiran, I was also thinking about how a set of relations, both in terms of, as you describe, a certain net or a certain woven jal, but at the same time, the kinds of everyday interactions where that jal is being, sort of woven together. So I was wondering if you could sort of share some ways in which, as a methodological sort of ways in which you could make sense of how interactions create, or sort of weave these relations. I mean, are there certain kinds of engagements that are more critical for these for sociality to be kind of made in certain ways? So just maybe or other kind of ways in which you kind of methodologically approach the question of how to study sociality.
Yeah, that's a good question. Methodologically, one, I would say, just, you do this kind of work as well, so its advantages as well as I do, but just the kind of insight that long-term immersive fieldwork offers, I think this is something that can emerge only through that kind of ethnographic long-term fieldwork that we do as anthropologists and sociologists. And I think that there's a way in which that allows you. So one of the things that methodologically I struggle with this, but I think anyone who does work in Pakistan actually winds up doing this kind of, is you have to kind of attune yourself to hearing what isn't being said. And I think in kinship relations, that comes especially important, right? Because that works in this sort of dual-edged kind of way. And learning how to attune myself to that. So that also meant paying attention to gossip, paying attention to that which was left out, which requires an attention to structure, right? So if I know that structurally this is the kind of thing that should be there and yet now it's missing, it's something that I can learn to pay attention to. So I think that kind of methodological attunement helps in navigating this micro-macro tension through which one can say that social life sort of weaves itself. And the other thing, I think, again, anthropologically, is I focused on, I collected stories, I collected gossip, I went around the offices, but in the end, focusing on a few families, focusing on, not learning everything there is to say about this particular town, but saying, here are these particular people that I develop meaningful relations with, and here is how the world makes sense from their point of view, I think is something that also allows that kind of depth.
I also want to ask you a little bit, or probe a little bit more about the question of caste in this context that you were describing and analyzing, which is, so the question of keeping people joined together, rishte jode rakhna, and the kind of investment and labor that demands. And I was wondering, how does, I mean, you mentioned that, this is a Dalit family, Dalit community. How does that kind of play into these investments? I mean, how does that kind of frame the way in which the sort of significance of Rishte Jode Rakhna is understood and put into practice?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think one of the most significant ways in which, in Pakistani society, or frankly anywhere, if we are thinking about upward mobility, the question of status or social status removed from, financial or, even doing white collar jobs becomes very central. And so one of the things that I heard repeatedly, not only from members of this family, but from people of other similar castes in a similar position, was that if everyone, if from our biradri of, if we are not able to rise together, at least in some way, maybe some rise more, some rise less, our own trajectory becomes questioned, right? It does not help for one family to outstrip the others. It does not lead to that kind of meaningful, the kinds of aspirations they have for themselves, it are actually not possible without taking their social circle along with them. And this leads to, it's not necessary. I mean, it speaks to the kinds of social cohesion that you see in, across different areas of Pakistan. But it's also, I think, a question of their very, very visceral level of knowledge of, our status in society is mediated by these are the factors through which we have to mediate our status. And this is what we need to overcome what it is that we are seeking to overcome. So I think it was a very visceral, very embodied kind of knowledge that if caste is what keeps us oppressed, then caste and community are also the only way we can rise out of it in some sense.
So in that, if one was to sort of expand then sort of the scale of your analysis to the rishtas that are being referred to by Kiran and her mother, are these kinds of tensions? I mean, it's interesting that you don't see them as generational tensions. I think that also sort of speaks to our kind of expectation that Kiran, with possible access to better education, would be actually taking on the role of Sita rather than it being the way it is. But I was going to ask you about that later. But something to kind of keep in mind. But I was thinking about also in terms of the other relations that that Kiran and Sita are constantly referring to when they're kind of dealing with their own intimate mother-daughter relation. How does that kind of factor, or how the playing out of those relations within the Dalit community shape the ways in which these intimate familial bonds are maintained and reproduced?
Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. So one interesting way in which that used to actually come out very clearly was that when Kiran made this accusation against her mother, one of the things that she would add or say as a subtext was that, she was the daughter-in-law of the house, of a particular kind of house, and that comes with particular kinds of roles. As I said, they were married. She was expected to, work for the social the way daughters-in-laws are supposed to work for the upkeep of this family that married into. And instead of doing that, Sita was on what her in-laws saw as a very personal and selfish trajectory of self-improvement. Right? She was not interested in the family. That's not how she saw it, but that's her reputation in the joint family. And so, which her daughter had kind of absorbed. And so what would wind up happening is that she had a very well-respected position in the community. So women from the neighborhood would sometimes come to her for advice, or, trying to ask if Sita knew about jobs for their sons or husbands, and, other kinds of problems. But people in the house saw that, which is clearly a signifier of Sita's social status in the neighborhood or the community, saw that as her neglecting the tasks of a daughter-in-law that would work. This is not what becomes the daughter-in-law of a family with a certain kind of stature, right? And so that kind of tension. And so Kiran would say to me that she felt obligated, where her mother had taken herself away from those house duties, she felt obligated to step in. So it came out in strange ways, like Kiran was obsessed, she would make chai, that kind of thing, which her mother had to stop making entirely in the house. So in those, really the most mundane of tasks, these larger questions about social standing would emerge in these ways. So that kind of tension about who is performing which tasks actually clued me into these questions.
And I guess when you're sort of looking at a particular social role, and I'm thinking about how, for example, Kiran is absorbing what it means to be part of the family that she's a part of, and what kind of role she needs to play. I was wondering if you could sort of help us zoom out of that and also sort of connect that to the larger question of being a minority, Hindu minority in Pakistan. We could sort of expand a little bit upon what are the ways in which these social.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Oh, really sorry. I think I had a internet meltdown, but hopefully I'm back. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Really sorry about that. It's just one of those things. Yeah, I don't know if you got to hear the question that I was.
I think I heard half of it.
Okay, so maybe I can just summarize it quickly. So I'm just interested in hearing more about how the kinds of labor, the kinds of intimate, the intimate tensions that you've described. If you could sort of zoom out a little bit and speak to the question of being a minority, because that's, I think, something that that would be very helpful to also address the kind of larger question of how that shapes the way in which these dynamics play out and shape this family's life and relations.
Yeah. So one of the metaphors that I use to think about religious minorities, or the subject position that religious minorities in Pakistan have, sort of had to take up, and in particular, thinking about Sindhi Hindus in this specific situation. The metaphor I was introduced to and that I find useful to think about is the idea that, of suddenly being rendered strangers in the place your ancestors have lived in for generations. And this feeling, what this, as I said, the Pakistani state is the Pakistani state, so we know that they have specific modes of, discriminatory behavior, neglect, even, standing by while violence happens, etc. But that is a different, that's one mode of what it means to be a minority in Pakistan. That's where most of the attention goes. But I also want to think about what it means, as I said, to be rendered strangers in this way. And that comes out, I think, in these kinds of intimate relations, not just in families, but in, in relating, and how your family relates to this outside world that has drastically changed, it's now been 3 generations. So there's a few more ways in which I paid attention to this ethnographically. One is, thinking about this idea that this is a society where violence against religious minorities is not just that it's condoned, it's one where it's simultaneously mundane and is completely unexpected, right? So anything you can say, anything that one can say or do can suddenly become grounds for, as we have seen, grounds for, the most outrageous kinds of violence. In cases of blasphemy accusations, for example, this is becoming all too clear. And so what that has actually led to is a hyper awareness of one's own speeches and actions, right? Anything you say, anything you don't say is potentially a minefield, right? Anything that one can overhear. And that leads to, that affects social life. That's not just self-policing, but what is the possibility of social life in which this is what's at the back of your mind every time you open your mouth, right? So that's one thing. And I call this, in one of my chapters, I think about what this means by thinking about how you can create, friendships or even neighborly relations if the neighborliness is taking place across, this kind of social geography of danger, right? It's actual physical danger. You are fearing for your own life in this constant way. The other thing that I think about, again, zooming back, and that I do think that focus on intimate relations helps us think about for this larger question of what it is to be a religious minority in Pakistan, or specifically to be a Hindu minority in Pakistan, is also to think about, the idea that there is I mentioned this earlier, I think, but this kind of social blockage. So this is obviously, a place where both Hindus and Muslims have lived for a very long time. In specific proportions that changed drastically in 1947, and in many ways, given that Hindus are now no longer even the most populous religious minority in Pakistan, I think it's the proportions go Muslim, then Christian, then Hindu, given what happened in 1971, it's almost like there is a way in which most Pakistanis have forgotten what it is to cohabit, right? Or to live in a multi-ethnic society, even though we bear the marks of having lived for a long time in multi-ethnic plural societies. And what I think these kinds of relationships help, or this kind of ethnographic focus helps me think about is what does it mean to be the marker of that multi-ethnic, that thing that doesn't make sense, that scar on the geography, right? That remainder, in one sense, of an older way, in which the rest of the society, as I said, these are families that are struggling to hold on. The national trajectory is completely different. The path that the nation's majority is on is not. It's very hard to keep yourself joined to that if in that kind of trajectory. So, what is that labor? To me, it seems like it requires superhuman effort, and in Pakistan, there's ways in which we can think about it becoming, at least in this particular situation, in the situation of what it means to live with plurality, it seems there is an increase of forgetting, increase of kind of blockage of historical and social memory. So this is, again, these kinds of relations help me think about that.
And when you speak of this sort of social blockage, and I think, and you sort of described it quite effectively in terms of the kind of superhuman effort this requires. Would you be able to also, did you also kind of look at kind of moments where, you also talked about exhaustion, the sort of the sort of very sort of limited emotional energy that is left for doing things that everyone has to do in a way. But are there also certain moments where these there's a certain kind of questioning of why do all of this? Why I mean, what form does a certain kind of I don't know, a crisis of sorts of relationality, if that ever happens, or seem to sort of happened in your fieldwork, that bus, this is just not something that we want to invest in anymore. And I'm thinking about also, the two kind of big public issues that make it to sort of national debates about, Hindu minorities. Sort of the debate about forced conversion, or the debate at a few years ago, there's also this debate about certain Hindu families migrating to India. I mean, are those debates, I mean, how are they kind of carried out within the realm of the family, or at what are the moments when those are the options that seem to be more appealing, or maybe the only options?
Yeah, I will say that the question of forced conversions, or the possibility that this is something that is happening, and it's happening to young women like Kiran, and Kiran would be, right, frankly, a prime candidate for this kind of thing, was at the back of everyone's mind every time the question of Kiran's marriage came up. It was, it worked as a kind of haunting. So, not that they actively policed Kiran, or there was any sort of one way in which this manifests. Obviously, in South Asian societies, this is increasing surveillance and policing of young women's bodies. So Kiran, but I think Kiran herself, her emphasis on her marriage to this person who her grandfather had picked out for her, who was a member of her extended clan, not her. And her dislike at going outside, spending a lot of time outside the house. So she would, sometimes go to relatives' houses, but not even spend a lot of time there. I do think that there's a way in which one way to deal with that kind of constant, this haunting, that this is a constant specter, is to, circumscribe your own life. which is what Sita in the end did accuse her of. So I do think that it was at the back of a lot of people's minds every time, the question of what Kiran is doing came up. With regard to your other question about migration, this methodologically, this presented a dilemma for me. To ask why someone would remain is to suggest that maybe they don't have to. And to me, that sounds like an unacceptable thing to ask someone, or to suggest that there's a possibility in which I remain and they do not. And I think given my own position, the fact that I do belong to the majority, my own positionality, that's not a question I ever felt I could directly ask. But I do think that, these are, I think what my engagement with this family and others did make clear is that there did seem to be an effort. You make things work as long as you can, but the possibility is there, this emphasis on jode rakhna also comes with, well, you have to keep it up because there's possibility it can fail, right? And if that's why I think of the fact that these are exhausted relations. They're really, because they can sputter out. It does become impossible at a certain point to gain sustenance from this larger national society and this larger national body politic. And then, there's the options are what they are. And they don't always, it's not always then you migrate specifically to India, but Pakistan in general, there's a large urban, migration, from smaller towns to bigger towns, out migration that we all know all too well here. So those paths then open up as, a way out of that exhaustion, and migration to India is one of those available paths.
Yeah. There's another that point that I mentioned in passing, but maybe something we can now return to, is also this question of generation, that your findings seem to sort of challenge, the sort of idea of what should be the aspiration of a young woman, especially one whose mother, has certain position and an office job, education, who sacrificed in her sort of understanding of her life to get there. Now, is that again something that is this a pattern of sorts in this community, or is this kind of sort of unique to Kiran and Sita's situation? I mean, is this within the sort of the Dalit community that you're looking at? Is there a kind of
when I started writing this and when I started observing these, I thought it was some very unique thing, and I thought there's something really interesting that we can think about through these dynamics. But I read this paper out a couple of years ago at a conference where there were just because of the panel, there were a lot of feminists in attendance, like older generational feminists from, my grandmother's generation. And all of them raised their hands and said, yeah, this is exactly what these young girls do. Of course, they all rebel. If the mother is one way, they will go out of their way to be the exact opposite. So on one level, one would not maybe expect the daughter of an educated office-going woman to be like this, but in one way, yes, this is Irigire's argument as well. Yes, actually, the generational impulse on her is actually to do the opposite of whatever it is she sees, right? And that is the only path through which one can conceptualize creating an individual self, right, away from the flesh of the mother. So it both is and it both isn't a generational dilemma, right? In the way I think about it. And I think what kept drawing them to one another is the fact that you cannot actually stake out your own path in this kind of, I rebel against my parents, whatever kind of way the realities of being a Dalit family in Pakistan actually kept them away from that kind of, romanticized way of looking at that actually. And it kept them bound to each other in ways that then express frustration. I would say it's generational, but I think generational dynamics don't always work the way, they're not linear. They're not linear in the way we would like to expect them to be.
I think there's maybe time for one more question. I don't know if you have any further questions from the audience. I think there was one that you've already addressed, which was about being a Hindu minority in Pakistan and how that impacts one's social roles in families. Maybe as a final word, maybe if you want to sort of say something about the sort of the ways in which you're thinking about putting this work into a larger conversation with minorities and with scholarship on minorities in Pakistan. I'm thinking of I just recently taught Sadia Saeed's work, for example, which on desecularization, of course, a very different set of questions and methodology, but in terms of how you see the kind of larger sort of trends or questions that scholarship and minorities is taking in Pakistan, and where you kind of locate yourself, if you do, in that.
Yeah, I think Dr. Farad had a question, and I think we went over that in our conversation. It was also the question you were just generally asking about zooming out. In terms of the larger conversation, I think there's a few actually really exciting trends, in scholarship on Pakistan, and I'm I'm excited to be in conversation. At least I hope I'm in conversation with these, these new scholars, these new works coming out. So I think there is a trend now to there's been historically the world scholarship in Pakistan is very state focused, and I think there's now people are increasingly moving away from that into thinking about Nausheen Ali has this beautiful book on affective states and thinking about that kind of emotional labor of creating a state. Shanila Khoja Mulji has again thinking about in very similar lines about the affective dimension of sovereignty and masculinity. So that stuff, that kind of dimension of thinking about the affective, thinking about the micro as it relates to the macro is stuff I'm excited about being in conversation with. Dr. Sadia Saeed actually has this very nice paper that I was looking at yesterday that just came out, I think, on thinking about the politics of, calling upon members of the national majority to curse to curse out specific religious minorities in Pakistan. And she compares it to earlier forms of, I think, early modern sovereignty. And I think that kind of work is so critical because it really helps me think about, what I said about the kind of topology of danger. So how it is that that's created. What are we saying when we say that there's a particular way in which religious minorities navigate very constrained settings? I think there is a really important conversation out there that's happening about exactly what it takes to build that with an attention on the fallout of that, the fallout on religious minorities, the way that hermeneutics of suspicion also play into this constant suspicion of whether is this person who he says or who she says they are, is again another dimension of the way in which everyday life is suffused with the tension of minority and majority in Pakistan. So that's stuff that I think there's a lot of really exciting work that people are doing on that. So I'm looking forward to trying to engage that.
Great. Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Ghazal Asif, for really kind of bringing a very sort of intimate portrait of what minority lives, what the state of being a minority and being a minority looks like in settings that we of course usually are not privy to, and for offering ways to think about the larger questions of being a minority in Pakistan through that portrayal. I very much look forward to reading more about your work, but also reading some of the analysis that you're offering here in print soon. So thank you once again for offering us all these important insights.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aman. Thank you. Yeah. And thank you to the coordinators at the Saida Waheed Institute for facilitating this. But thank you so much for this conversation. That was